So I'm gonna tell you just a little bit about me. That sexy dude with the beard is my best friend. His name's Wenzel. He's a total trophy husband. I'm raising these 3 tiny humans. They're an adventure in of themselves. I am blessed to have 2 of the most incredible women I've ever met as my sisters, and they are so important to my heart. I've done judo for 26 years. I was actually an Olympic alternate, which means I was America's very best loser, not to brag, okay? And so my judo family is very important to me. Fun Val fact, I am an ordained minister. This is me officiating my sister's wedding to my now brother. I call it that one time I married my brother and sister. So if anyone wants an impromptu wedding ceremony after the session, I'm your gal. I can probably figure out the laws in North Carolina. All of this just to say, I hate hearing from someone when I don't know who they are. So that's Val in a nutshell, Let's get into actual disaster recovery. So really, disaster recovery is my jam. I was tasked with writing the DR plan when I worked at Airbus in 2019. And when we were doing all of the sprint assignments and my colleagues saw that I got this one, they were like, man, who did you tick off? Ooh. And I was like, are you kidding? I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I live my life thinking about what could go wrong and how to mitigate it before it happens. Like, oh my God, it's the first time ever that my weird, traumatic disorder has actually benefited me. I would love to write a plan based on what could go wrong. Disaster recovery planning is trying to be psychic, thinking of all of the worst case scenarios and trying to figure out how to stop them before they happened, and if they do, what you're gonna do in the moment. The first thing that you wanna think about is every step of the way, what has to happen for your end users to have 100% uptime? That's the goal, right? We're living the dream if we've got 100% uptime. What all has to happen? And so if you're at a very large company, that might look like only caring about the infrastructure side of things or only writing a plan for the software side of things. If you're at a startup or don't have an office manager, I mean, at the time when I was at Airbus, there were 30 of us total. And I know Airbus is a huge company, but we were like a little subsidiary, so we were pretty much like Airbus's college-age kids. Like, we had daddy's money and health insurance, but he didn't really check on us very often, So I wrote into our plan a lot of logistics and office concerns and human resource concerns, not just the software side of things. So whatever breadth you have at your company, figuring out what you're responsible for that makes sure your end users have 100% uptime is kind of the place to start. So if you write a DR plan and put it in Google Drive and ask your colleagues to write it or to read it, they will not. Spoiler alert. They'll pretend that they're going to, and then they won't. So how do you make sure that everyone on the team, everyone in the company, absolutely knows the plan? Well, it starts with drills and simulations. One of the best weeks of my life, so when I was at Airbus, our product basically analyzed drone images, compared them to last week's satellite images, because spoiler alert, Airbus is 100% photographing us right now. And it was cool because like after the car forest fires, long before a human could get in and say this house is a total loss, we could get a drone in, get some images, and that family got their money faster. Software making the world better. So one of the best weeks of my life was we did what we called Hurricane Jerry. And my colleague Jerry staged it, but we just caused an artificial spike in use. Went through all of the different things that could go wrong with this process, and it was super fun. We actually really enjoyed the whole week. We found all sorts of software glitches through things like, they told me to outline where I wanted a drone to go, and I was like, okay, well, how is the pricing structure? Oh, it's by square mile? Cool. I'm gonna starburst to all the houses and make everyone miserable, and that's how we stopped that from being an option. So yeah, frequent drills and simulations, basically making sure that the plan that you've written up isn't just good in theory, it's good in actuality. Because I don't know about y'all, but I have a lot of plans that seem like a real good idea in my head, and then whoo, not great in real life. Yeah, so again, like the whole point is you don't want to wait till the bad thing happens. Try to avoid the bad thing before. So we're going to start out talking about actual software issues, like what happens if someone in Ohio cuts a cable going into an AWS data center. Like what could go wrong software-wise? Because I had to go through it, you're going to go through it too. And we're going to talk about some of the more logistical and office-related things as well. Because, especially if you're on a small team, this can set you apart and be a huge value add and make your boss think you're super cool, which leads to raises, and we all like that. But people first. Anyone who knows me will tell you people first is my motto. By my estimation, the only reason to be on this rock hurtling through an ever-expanding multiverse is the other people on the rock. So let's start there. You're going to want to designate a DR team. So if you're at a big company, if you're even a medium-sized company, it doesn't make sense to say, Sarah's responsible for X and Mike's responsible for Y. Because at a larger company, one, you're going to have a lot more turnover, and it just doesn't make sense. So if you're at a small company, it might make sense, right? Like when we were only 30 of us, it did make sense to designate certain tasks to our CTO because we only had one and he wasn't going anywhere. At a larger company, you're going to want to say, hey, in the event that this happens, the senior most back-end engineer is responsible for X task. You always want to call people out. So in a previous life, I got a psych degree. And I don't want to brag, but I've now paid $85,000 in student loans for a psych degree with a gender studies minor, which enables me to say, would you like fries with that? So that's neat. One of the things that I learned during my psych degree is that if I'm standing up here and I say, will someone please help me? No one's going to help me. I have to make creepy eye contact. Will you please help me? Uh-huh. You have to call out your colleagues by job title or some designation because in general, people don't want to go above and beyond and they shouldn't have to. You should get paid to do the job you were hired to do, not to work at midnight because something's on fire. So if you want help putting out the fire, make sure you absolutely designate who's responsible for what so there's no question about it. Designate a backup. So we had sort of a preliminary plan in place when I went on maternity leave. I only got 6 weeks, and can I just say, you don't want someone who hasn't slept in 6 weeks working on your product. There's still bugs in their code from me. And so my colleague went on maternity leave a month after I did. Well, she was designated as who was supposed to be responsible for a large number of tasks, and when things went wrong, there was no backup. People were scrambling trying to figure out whose job it was to fix stuff. Always have a backup. And make sure they have access. You can designate a backup all day long, but if your IAM permissions don't enable them to do anything, well, I've got bad news. We definitely ran into situations where the backup for one of our people didn't even have access to get into the part of the building he would need to be in to do his job. Well, that's not useful. It's like saying, how can I be pregnant? I meant to take my birth control. It's not useful. Go ahead and designate who declares an incident. Who's in charge of saying, something has gone sideways, stuff is on fire, and we are putting into place this plan that we've created. And I know that seems like a silly thing to specify, but you'd be surprised how many, so when I write my talks, I send out Google Forms via the Twitterverse. And I ask people for their worst horror stories on whatever subject it is. And you'd be surprised how many people responded to this one saying, yeah, we had an outage, but no one knew what to do or who was in charge of saying, this is a real problem, it's time to work overnight, y'all, we gotta fix this. It came up a lot from the responses. Again, who owns each step? For whatever thing that you are trying to mitigate, who is in charge of making sure that this is resolved? And call them out by title, by whatever designation you need to, because again, with the creepy eye contact, they're not gonna help you if there's just a fire. This one, who talks to the press? I used to work at Salesforce, and I never had to think about that, because at Salesforce, there's a designated team of like 1,000 people to talk to the press. Not my issue, not my circus. But at Airbus, we went for a time, as a small 30-person group where we didn't even have a marketing representative in between employees. Who talks to the press? At what point do you throw up a landing page and say, hey y'all, sorry, we're having an outage? At what point do you even consider a press release? Something to take into consideration when you're writing. So this is a big one. You can't have one way to communicate. So let's say your team communicates almost exclusively via Slack, and Slack has an outage. Now what? Right? Have multiple ways to communicate, and you need to create a list that needs to be updated periodically, and decide the order of communication. So what does this look like? So in general, we communicate via Slack, and if Slack has an outage, we communicate via Gmail. And if the end is nigh and Google is down, we call each other on the phone like our ancestors did. But you have to have an updated communication list that is, again, if you're at a huge company, it might make sense to do it every couple of months. If you're at a smaller company, you might, we get a new hire, we update the communication list. You have to look at what makes sense for your team, but everyone needs to be able to reach everyone no matter what. Not just your employees. On your communication list, you're gonna wanna list all vendors, your building manager, literally anything that could break, anything that could go wrong, you need to know who to call, and that information needs to be available to the entire team. So if you have let's say you've got some on-prem servers, you need to know who to call to service those if it's not in-house, right? If you're working in an office and not remotely, you need to know the building management and who to call if a water line breaks. Just little things, little things. And again, periodic updates. This is so fun without my speaker notes. I won't lie, y'all. I won't lie. This is super fun. So getting into what goes wrong with the actual product. So as it turns out, the software doesn't write itself. The people do with the machines. You need to inventory everything that your team has. And you don't want to write, we have 11 laptops. Get granular. Include serial numbers. Okay, we have 7 MacBook Pros, 17 inches with these specifications, and we've got a few HPs and blah, blah, blah. I don't know why, but some people do, I'm told. But yeah, get really granular with every piece of hardware your team needs to do their jobs. Because as it turns out, without the machines, the people can't write the product. Go ahead and take into account, if something breaks, are we going to replace it? Is there budget for that? And if so let's say you've got 10 on-prem servers and 3 break. Do you need to replace all 3? How many do you really need to run your product, right? Go ahead and take into account what is allowed to be broken, and it's not a huge deal, and what genuinely needs to be replaced immediately. And then work into the budget some money for that. Oh, nowhere to go, that's a fun one. So if your office manager is in charge of replacing broken machines, well, they can't go to an Apple store to get an HP replacement. They can't get the best machines at, Best Buy, to be honest. You need to tell them exactly where to go to get replacement machines. You need to tell them where to go to buy your new servers if you need to do that. Anything that breaks, they need to have a really easy checklist, because the last thing you want is a non-technical person replacing your laptop. You hear me? No. I once got a replacement laptop that might as well have said Play School on it. I was like, how am I supposed to be a DevOps engineer when this machine literally won't run Docker? Right? Go ahead and take that into account ahead of time. Okay, so the automatic failover. So there's a lot of routes you can go with this, and the most successful one from my survey was basically having a fully mirrored production copy of your product. Now that's a lot, right? However, so the biggest complaint that I've heard is that it's expensive to have an automatic failover to a production quality replica. It doesn't have to be expensive. You don't have to spin up those clusters. You don't have to run that second site. It can just sort of chill over there in the ether as long as you're updating it consistently. And that means if you are fully on CI/CD, well, it needs to push to that second production as well. Your database has to constantly be mirrored. But the most successful stories that I got when I was asking people about their DR situations were people who had a fully mirrored backup recovery site that could just be spun up. And maybe we're talking 5 to 10 minutes of data loss, which is not ideal. Hopefully it's less than that, but it's better than nothing. It's better than your end user going to use your product and getting angry and deciding your competitor is better. Obviously, your DR plan needs to include a lot of monitoring for unusual traffic. If, like, again, at Airbus, we didn't have constant daily users, but then we had huge spikes of users after a natural disaster, after a forest fire, after a hurricane. So if we saw a huge spike when there wasn't a natural disaster, that's a big red flag. Always monitor for traffic. So this was one that had not occurred to me before I sent out the survey. Do you know that sometimes GitHub and GitLab have issues? I didn't know that. I didn't think about it. What happens, especially if you're truly in a CI/CD setup, what happens if no one can push or pull? What happens if you've got a major release coming up in the next 24 hours and people are just coding away and they can't put their changes into your code base? That's a problem. So maybe that looks like, if you're using GitHub as your default, maybe it looks like having a backup in GitLab. Maybe it looks like every time someone pushes to main branch, there's a backup somewhere. It did not occur to me that this might be a thing until 3 different people responded with, yeah, we had this huge issue where we had an update coming up. We had to push out this code and we couldn't. Something to consider. Data loss. Okay, so as an end user, if I log into Amazon, or try, and the site's down for like 5, 10, 20 minutes, I'm gonna be irritated. That's gonna irritate me because Drunk Val likes to buy stuff on Amazon late at night. And she's not happy if she can't log in. That's gonna irritate me. But if I log in successfully to Amazon and my save for later items are gone because of data loss, now I'm pissed. For my money, the worst thing that your end user can experience is data loss. We have gotten spoiled rotten where we expect our data to be persistent at all times. And your end user wants data to always be there. So what does that look like? How do you mitigate that? Again, there needs to be active replication. Your database absolutely cannot exist like on its own. It's not an island. It needs to have a twin, a clone. And it needs to be a part of the fully mirrored recovery site. The most successful people who shared their stories absolutely were backing up their data constantly. And I mean, one person responded, and I thought this was really cool. They ran out of GCP, but their backup was in AWS. That way you don't have to worry about regions and such. If Google as a whole somehow has a problem, their backup was not even touching their original application. I thought that was pretty neat. So now we're gonna get into the other side, the logistics, office, cool things. I got made fun of a lot. I wrote this in January of 2020. And I was told that I was paranoid. And just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Okay, just so we're clear. But I wrote in a plan for like, what if we can't work in the office? I've been following the story on CNN for a month, but I honestly wasn't thinking we were about to face a global pandemic. I was thinking more like, I work in a really old building that's been renovated, and what if it catches on fire? But I did write in, what happens if we just can't work in the office all of a sudden overnight? March 13th, I got some apologies. So we've been working remotely for the last couple years, most of us. I hate remote work. Does anyone here like remote work? Okay, who here likes remote work with 3 children at home? Bueller? Bueller, anyone? Yeah, no. I actually hate working from home. I'm distracted and I'm thinking about the dishes that aren't done and the laundry that's not done. And I actually am a fully remote employee, so I pay for a co-working space so I can go to an office. Some teams do not need to be in physical proximity, but some people really do. And so you do want to consider, if we can't work together, if the office is not, accessible, do we want to have a backup location? And even if it's just for once a month team meetings to brainstorm or huddle or whatever, something to consider. The whole working from home thing. Again, if you have to go remote again, all of a sudden, do you want to write in a provision for childcare? Or the people who have kids, maybe you limit their workload and redistribute and deprioritize certain things so that no one's overworked. It's not the child-free people's job to do all the work, but maybe you want to write in like what should be deprioritized if you have people in a situation where they just can't focus at home. Safety issues. I recently gave this talk in Portugal, and they laughed hysterically at this one, because that doesn't happen over there. But, I work in an office, well, I did at Airbus. I worked in an office that was near the CDC and several embassies. There was no security and no doors with locks, and it was something to consider. If you are doing the logistical side of a DR plan, think about employee safety. Think about if there is a fire, a flood, an active threat in the building, where does everyone go, and make sure that people do this, some sort of drill or simulation, once a quarter or so. Make sure everyone knows. Again, when you're on a very small team, what happens if half your team is sick at the same time? It's something to consider. We ran into, several times, we had so many people out on PTO, especially when I was the only DevOps engineer, and I was out for 6 weeks. Our lead backend engineer was out for 12 weeks. She banked her PTO because she's smarter than I am, and she got a real maternity leave. What happens if half your team is just out? Again, how do you decide what gets deprioritized, what gets moved around, what really matters, and how do you distribute that work on a lesser team? So this is just stuff that came out of the survey. So again, not all dependencies are the same. When you're thinking about things that can break, things that don't work, things that might malfunction, kind of, take a step back and say, okay, if you have an engineer without a machine for a day and a half, 2 days, is that really a big deal? Depends on the engineer, depends on the days, right? Go ahead and decide what's going to take priority and what really needs to be handled. Also, not all disasters are equally likely. As it turns out, it is far more likely that someone is going to cut a cable going into a data center and bring down your software than an active shooter situation. So don't spend equal amounts of time on all the different scenarios. The ones that are most likely, the ones that are most impactful, dedicate your time to figuring out how to mitigate that. I spent probably 2 days on what happens if GCP goes down. I spent 10 minutes on our active shooter plan, because not all threats are equally likely and they don't all deserve the same amount of attention. I cannot tell you the importance enough of having simulations. Do things that don't make any sense. Like, okay, If you're running a DR drill, what happens if your product's down and you have to go over to the mirrored replication site? Do it under completely crazy circumstances. For example, don't let any of your seniors or leads participate. Make your juniors and mids do it, right? Do things that are so incredibly unlikely, but force people to get really good at the plan. Make sure that your junior-most team members not only know the plan, but are capable of carrying it out. Because again, especially on a small team, what if your juniors are the only ones working for whatever reason? It's important to make sure that they know exactly what to do. And then go ahead and test it again, and then again and again. Testing one time is not useful. And so depending on the size of your team and the size of your company, it might make sense that anytime you get a new employee, you do a disaster drill. Just one day of mayhem. It might make sense that you do it every quarter, no matter what the turnover. Only you know, based on your team size and your company size and the breadth of what you're supposed to plan for. Most people at big companies don't have to consider the office or logistical nightmares. Most of us probably just have to write out what happens if we have data loss, if we're hacked or whatever. You will know what makes sense for your team as far as frequency of testing and frequency of updating things like communication lists, hardware inventory. I can't tell you that part, only you know. But the important part is test it again and again, and then again until you're so bored with testing it you can't breathe. Yeah, so that's me. And if there's any questions, I'm here. But thank you all for being here today. Yeah.
I wanted to, if you don't mind, I wanted to point out 2 best practices that I learned working at a nuclear weapons laboratory.
Oh, absolutely.
The first is managers will resist declaring a disaster, so don't rely on that concept. As much as possible, have objective metrics.
Mm-hmm.
So in the computer world, it would be if X percentage of your customer base has an outage, you have a disaster, no matter what anybody says.
Yep.
The other is big believer in a digital office, except you need a paper copy of all your disaster recovery.
Yep. Yep. No, as it turns out, the internet betrays us sometimes. It's cruel that way. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else?
Where do you put in a budget the ER planning part? Not the ER part, the planning itself as a cost. How do you allocate that money?
So if you're working at like a consultancy where you have to have X number of billable hours, that's really frustrating. I would argue that it's just going to take longer for you to write your plan, and your leadership has to be forward thinking enough to recognize that maybe for a few weeks you're billable for 35 because you're spending an hour or so a day, maybe 2, working on this, and when the worst happens, it will pay off. It is really hard to convince accounting that non-billable hours matter. says the lady in DevOps who literally is not billable. But if I make everyone else more efficient and they're getting more work done, it's still of value. I hear you though, it's really hard. If your leadership isn't forward thinking, there is no good answer. But I would argue that anyone who tasks you with writing this must see the value in it. And they would necessarily have to be okay with, all right, this week we get 30 to 35 billable hours, but when something bad happens, we've got a plan and we know how to address it. I know y'all aren't going to believe this, but not all leaders are forward thinking. I have not. That's actually a really good idea. I ought to do that. I'm super ADHD. I wish you would tweet me about it so that I would remember. Because I don't have a pen and paper, and if I don't write it down, it doesn't exist. Have I compared ITDR planning to FEMA's incident response?
There's a lot of like online information that's available for free on ICS.
Yeah,
FEMA provides for like search and rescue or EMS.
excellent. Now, thank you. I appreciate that. All right, so I'm super hard of hearing, a little louder. Yeah. No. So I was winging it when I did mine. I didn't know what BIA was until halfway through writing my plan. I would say that far more Googling should happen than happened with me. I ended up throwing out the first half of my plan and rewriting it after further research. I would say if you're tasked with any sort of DR planning at all, incident response, whatever it's called in your company, I would look at, okay, historically, what has caused downtime? What has caused outages? Start there. It's all really the same. BIA, DR, incident handle, whatever you want to call it, it really is all just the same thing with a different label. Thinking about what could go wrong and trying to make sure that doesn't happen. Yep. There are definitely times where we over-process things that don't need that much process. I actually do a whole talk called, Oops, We're So Agile, We're Waterfall Again. It happens. Too much process is a problem. I mean, I did because I was at such a small company. Now, if I had been tasked with any sort of DR planning or whatever at Salesforce with 65,000 employees, it would have looked very different. But with 30 people in my little subsidiary, it was all the same. It was just, okay, Val, make it not break. And if it does break, fix it. Okay, sure, I'd love to. There doesn't always need to be a clear line of delineation with title and process. You need to look at your team size, your company size, the actual ask, and what makes sense. At Salesforce, on a DevOps team, if I had been asked to do any sort of DR planning, I wouldn't have included anything to do with office logistics, for example. There's a whole team that handles that. But at Airbus, it made sense, right? I mean, we don't all work at the same place, and we have to just individualize what makes sense for us and our company. Anybody else? Well, thank y'all so much for being here today. It's my first time speaking at All Things Open. In fact, All Things Open a few years ago is the only conference I've ever not shown up to when I said I would because I had COVID. And I'm so happy to finally be here. Thanks for being here with me.